All right, welcome back into the channel. I am John Kurtz, and I'm very pleased to be joined by, from CBS Sports, Shehan Jeyarajah. Always love getting his insight, one of the best college football reporters around. What has it been like, particularly with the revenue sharing, the House settlement, seeing all that stuff come down the pipe, trying to keep track of everything that's happening there?
Yeah, my political science minor finally coming in useful. I've got a few friends who are lawyers, so I try to lean on them a little bit if there's something that's especially confusing. But no, it's been a fascinating time. Of course, so many people trying to message different things, and even from a legal perspective, right? Like you see lawyers trying to use the court of public opinion to move people as well. You know, obviously, Florida State's administration has been so visible and vocal about trying to essentially break the terms of the ACC's grants of rights. So it's been an interesting time. I'm definitely looking forward to not knowing anything about run fit schemes instead of not knowing anything about how the Court of Appeals is going to work. But it's been a fun time. And I'll tell you what, I mean, for me, I do love a lot of the the societal aspects, I guess, of college athletics too. And so this has given me a whole new kind of opportunity to try some new things out.
I love it. Well, with the revenue sharing coming and schools about to have to, chalk up about $22 million, it sounds like, to begin anyway to participate here in revenue sharing. Like us in Big 12 country, I think the question here is okay, we see this. Does this mean that Big 12 schools are going to fall further behind? Does it keep it about the same? And I know in some ways I'm asking you an impossible question there, but what is your gauge right now on what this will do between the gap between the Power Two and then the Big 12 and ACC?
Yeah, I wish that I had a better answer other than we'll see, but there's a couple things to keep an eye on as this sort of opens up. And one thing to keep an eye on, well, I mean, even before that, the number of schools in the Big 12 who end up trying to get all the way up to that $22 million figure. Now, I got to talk to Brett Yormark a few weeks ago, and he essentially said he wouldn't guarantee that every single Big 12 school will pay up to that $22 million mark, but he did say we feel like we have a chance to be really competitive. One of the focuses of the spring business meetings in the Big 12 was how can we allow schools on their own campuses to try and generate more revenue, whether that is things like the new rules, for example, with having field sponsorships, just as an example. And also he said it's up in some ways to the Big 12 office to try to find ways to generate more revenue so that we're able to fill some of those gaps as well. So I think that's the first piece, is the number of schools that actually try to get up to that $22 million figure. But another big piece of it, I think, is just going to be the details of how it's implemented. One, out of $22 million, is that going to actually be a cap? How do collectives kind of fall into this? There was some reporting done the other day that actually Nebraska's athletic director Troy Dannon said that two different schools had a $23 million NIL budget at this point, which already exceeds, of course, what exists. And so there's been some optimism that potentially as part of this settlement, the NCAA will gain some legitimate enforcement power when it comes to outside payments. Now, the question is, and actually I even made reference to this in one of my stories that I wrote around this topic, the city of Las Vegas just decided to pay out $100,000 in essentially endorsement dollars to WNBA players on the Las Vegas Aces. And the WNBA is trying to figure out, is there any means that we have of stopping this? Is this circumventing the salary cap? And I think that's going to be a similar issue that we run into in college athletics, where people say, well, this is, it's a collective, but they're doing endorsement stuff. And this shouldn't count towards that $22 million. So the devil is really going to be in the details with some of this stuff. But I'll tell you what, there is a scenario where this ends up being a good thing for the Big 12, where a lot of programs end up spending up to that $22 million, where ultimately they're able to, in many ways, compete with the Big 10 and the SEC. But so much is going to be in the details.
Yeah, and do you think, I know Brett Yormark was asked about this the other day too. I think it was on the conference call or perhaps somewhere else, but he was asked about the private equity that everybody's talking about here. And I know we're really supposed to call it private capital if you ask them, as opposed to private equity. But is that somewhere where the Big 12 could utilize that to help be hitting those numbers, to get some money up front from these big private equity companies? And then you're going to have to kick them, obviously, some of your revenues on the back end there. But is that the type of thing that you think the Big 12 could engage in?
Well, I think that's more of a last resort for the Big 12 and for some of their member institutions. Of course, it's circling around right now that a lot of private equity firms are potentially looking into whether college athletics is a good investment. And what private equity and private capital, more than anything, are looking for is they're looking for assets that are undervalued, that financially have the ability to perform better. Now, the question I think from my perspective has always been, well, how does this usually work? Usually it's cutting costs, increasing revenue. And, for example, does that work in an athletic construct where potentially you want to deliver a quality football team, but maybe that's not actually the best business decision? I don't know if that's going to long-term be a good decision. So I don't think that that's at the top of their minds right now. But again, if it ends up being that there's this huge gap that the Big 12 struggles to compete, I think that's something that you'll see. Now, when I look at a school like Florida State, who obviously is trying so hard to get out of the ACC and to compete more nationally, I think that that's a school who kind of feels like we have to seize this moment. And if we can use private capital in the short term to fill some of those gaps, it sets us up better for the long term. But I don't see that being a top priority for Big 12 schools right now.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. And certainly you'd hope that that's not the route Big 12 schools are going to have to go. You bring up the ACC. Do you have any level of optimism that 5 years from now we'll still be talking about the ACC? And I suppose that's fairly apropos because now with the College World Series working out the way it has, the Pac-12 is officially done. People are now officially writing the obit of the Pac-12. So will the ACC be a conference in 5 years? I guess I'll just put it that way.
Well, I think that there's a couple pieces to this. One, I mean, especially for Florida State, and I'll throw Clemson into there as well, I think that the existing ACC schools are going to essentially do everything in their power to make them pay that hefty buyout. Some estimates have said $200, $300, $400, $500 million potentially could be coming back to these other schools if they try to break the grant of rights. And so I think that there is going to be that focus on trying to make it happen. The other piece as well is that so much of this is going to come down to what the Big Ten and SEC want. And talking to people around the SEC, I don't think that there's this great desire to expand much more past 16. Now, for the right schools, I think that they would add maybe 2, let's say, or maybe up to 4, I could see. But I don't even know that Florida State's one of them. I think that maybe North Carolina is the type of school that you're looking at. I think that maybe Virginia is more the type that you're looking at, where you can get into a new territory as opposed to saturating your market even more by going further into Florida. So that's going to be the other piece is when you look at the schools that are in the ACC right now, we're up to 17 schools. How many of them will have a different place to go if the ACC does break up? We ran into that a little bit with the Pac-12, but ultimately the Big 12 signaled in a lot of ways, no, I mean, we will take almost all of you guys if this conference breaks up. I don't know that there's the same level of optimism or desire for ACC schools if the ACC breaks up. So I think that the most likely scenario is something like 4 to 6 ACC schools ultimately do break off and find their way into maybe the Big Ten or the SEC. Maybe they consider independence. I don't know. But then the rest of them, they try to sort of backfill more like what the Big 12 did than necessarily what the Pac-12 did.
Well, it is a year where, speaking of conference realignment, we're kicking off like the new Big Ten, the new SEC, new Big 12 this year with everybody changing places here. And I have to admit, I laughed a little bit seeing it was USC fans the other day. I think it was Message Board Geniuses that called them out on complaining a little bit about their treatment with the TV schedule in the Big Ten. I had to think like this is going to start happening, right? We're going to start seeing this with big programs that are moving to these new leagues that are no longer going to be top billing or top dog there. A lot of people have always done the Texas or Oklahoma thing. Who's more cut out for it right now in the SEC? I'll just ask you more broad-based, like who is most at risk to falling into what these USC fans seem to be experiencing a little bit here, like somebody that could have some buyer's remorse perhaps a little bit early on?
Well, I think that most of the schools who have decided to make a move understand why they have to make the move, whether or not they really wanted to make the move. And one that I certainly don't think has any buyer's remorse, but we started to see BYU is about to get a whole bunch of those night games, right? Like they're about to be at 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, back to back to back. Like that's, I think, going to be a huge part of the Big 12 strategy is to put them in that fourth time window. Maybe we see Arizona there, maybe we see Utah there, but I think that there's an understanding that that was probably going to happen when you decided to move to a league that plays most of its games during the midday slate. So, I think that that's one dynamic to definitely keep an eye on is just the scheduling aspect of this. UCLA, again, I think they're going to play an insane amount of 10:30 Eastern time games just because I think that's a value add potentially for the Big Ten. So that would be one piece of it. I think that when you look at, look, the schools from the West Coast moving to the ACC, again, it's a similar thing. They understand why they had to do it, but this is about to be miserable if you are a Cal fan or a Cal player. I don't know how you make the pitch to Cal athletes that you have to play all of your games across the country, that you only have one local conference game at Stanford, and otherwise you have to go to Dallas closest or potentially to the East Coast. I think that that's going to be a brutal situation that I don't think is going to be tenable for all that long. I think ultimately Stanford and Cal especially are going to have to make a long-term decision about, is this something that we're willing to do? Are you even willing to maybe take some Mountain West schools and have a bi-coastal league as opposed to just having, potentially two schools on the West Coast while everybody else plays on the East Coast? So I think that will certainly be a brutal decision. But I think that when I look at the other schools that ended up joining these other conferences, I think that everybody else mostly understands what they're getting themselves into. Now, there are scenarios like Utah, obviously, where they wish that they could still be a member of the Pac-12 or try to push for the Big Ten, but they also understand why they're in the Big 12 and not in these other leagues as well. So I think that in terms of buyer's remorse, everybody was kind of forced into the position that they're in. So I don't know that phrase specifically is going to be one that's going to be top of mind.